Je voulais le dire à Roberta aussi. Ladies and gentlemen, dear delegates, good afternoon. On behalf of LuxFlag, I'm extremely honored to welcome you at our LuxFlag side event at COP27. The Luxembourg Finance Labeling Agency, LuxFlag, is an independent and international non-profit association created in Luxembourg in 2006 by 7 public and private funding partners: ABBL, ADA, ALFI, LFF, VIB, the Government of Luxembourg, the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. As part of our mission to promote sustainable finance and responsible investment, LuxFlag is pleased to join the EIB, the delegation of Luxembourg, Belgium and the Netherlands, with an event dedicated to policy and market challenges of impact investing. The objective of this side event is to shed light on key market challenges faced by impact asset managers, investors, and multilateral development banks, and on how regulatory frameworks are evolving to enable the transition towards a more sustainable economy. In this first part of our side event, Finance in Motion, a leading global impact asset manager and advisor, will walk us through the main challenges market practitioners face when investing via their impact funds. In addition, the European Investment Bank, one of the initiators of some of Finance in Motion impact funds, will contribute to the panel by sharing its long-standing investor expertise in impact investing. In the second part of our side event, we will discuss how the UN SDGs and sustainable finance regulation could help overcome some of the most pressing challenges faced by the investment community today. Policy recommendations will be explored with the objective of identifying ways to reorient more private-public capital towards sustainable projects. We will then also analyze solutions on how to unlock the potential of impact investing. One main challenge faced for investors now is to identify truly sustainable and impact products. LuxFlag has a critical ongoing role to play in helping the industry meet some of the current market challenges. LuxFlag's mission is twofold: to support and enable the financial sector sustainability transition at an international level, and to identify sustainable finance leaders through our impact labels and provide them with market credibility for their governance and internal processes. With our external and strict review of fund documentation and portfolios, LuxFlag awards impact labels to Article 8 and 9 products under the SFDR classification, meeting a number of eligibility criteria according to those required and defined by group of experts for each label. Currently, we have 4 impact labels. The microfinance label, our historical one, which is dedicated to microfinance vehicles. The primary objective, the LuxFlag microfinance label, is to reassure investors that the microfinance investment vehicles actually invest directly or indirectly to microfinance products. The environmental label is reassuring investors that the investment product actually primarily invests their assets in environment-related sectors in a responsible manner. It requires eligible funds to have a portfolio of investments in environmental-related sectors corresponding to at least of 75% of the fund's total assets. The climate finance label, dedicated to investment products with at least 75% of total asset investments related, with a clear and direct link to mitigation and adaptation of climate change or cost-cutting activities. And finally, the green bond label reassures investors that the green bond follows internationally recognized standards and uses its proceeds to finance green projects. At LuxFlag, we verify not only the product and its portfolio, but also the institution underlying processes, including that the construction process for the portfolio adheres to the label criteria. The labeling process involves not only the review of documentation, but sampling and testing the portfolio to ensure that the research process is systematic and has been conducted properly. LuxFlag complements legislative requirements such as the CSFDR, in which a sustainability disclosure is placed on asset managers by providing a critical additional layer of quality assurance by independently reviewing and verifying that market participants' most substantive sustainability standards. Our side event will bring together 3 exceptional experts to delve into market as well as policy challenges of impact investing. We will also learn how concrete example of investment products, the Green for Growth funds, labeled by LuxFlag since more than 10 years, first with the environmental label and later once created by the climate and finance label. So for the first session, please allow me to welcome Britta Boscher, the Head of Product Development at Finance in Motion, and Ella Cravey, Chief Sustainable Finance Advisor at the European Investment Bank. And also, for the second part of our panel discussion, we have the pleasure to have Professor Dirk Andreas Zetsche, Professor of Law, holder of the ADA Shared Financial Law, Inclusive Finance from the University of Luxembourg. Please to introduce now the panel session.
I think it comes out of here.
Yeah. So, according to the latest report published by the Global Impact Investing Network, the worldwide impact investing market has topped up to $1 trillion. Although this definitely serves as a positive signal, it is also a call for further more consistent allocation of capital, and especially an intentional required right now if we are to achieve the UN SDGs by 2030 and by 2050. In this first part of our side event, we will discuss key market challenges faced by asset managers, investors, and multilateral, and on how regulatory framework are evolving to enable the So to look more closely at how to unlock the potential of impact investing, I have the pleasure to welcome 2 experts who represent 2 renowned institutions active in impact investing. Britta Boscher, who joined Finance in Motion in February 2022 as Head of Product Development. Prior to joining FIM, Britta has worked for many years at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, leading capital market investments in the financial sector, structuring innovative products in the banks region, and developing new institutional approaches to investing in sustainable assets. Ella Cravey, the Chief Sustainable Finance Advisor at the European Investment Bank, who is having a function since February 2022. Prior to start a new position, Ella headed the Capital Market Department of the EIB. She has participated in all of the EU Sustainable Finance Working Group, so high-level expert group on sustainable finance, the technical expert group on sustainable finance, and the platform. Between March 2018 and January 2022, Hela was an alternate member of the board of directors of the European Investment Fund. Britta and Hela, a warm welcome to both of you.
Shall I go ahead?
As an introduction, could you please, if each of you give us your perspective on how your organization are contributing to impact investing and present a concrete example of such commitment? Britta, would you like to start?
Yes.
With your presentation?
Hi.
Thank you.
Can you hear me well enough through this? Otherwise, I'm moving on. Yes? Let me do this. Yeah, I'll do it. Okay, let me try it like this. I think that's probably better. So, hi everyone. Nice to see you. Thank you for having me, Isabel. I'm here today to present Finance in Motion and speak about how we as a global impact asset manager contribute to sustainable finance. Finance in Motion works in emerging markets and manages and structures around 9 funds at the moment. These funds are of blended nature, so our investors are from the public sector, multilateral development banks, and obviously private sector investors as well. The funds in Finance in Motion have currently around 3 billion assets under management, but you can think of that this translates roughly into 6 billion of investments being made today under the funds. They all have a green or a social scheme. So if we speak about social, what we mean here is MSME finance mostly, employment, housing, and the agriculture sector. And if we speak about green finance, it's green energy, climate finance, also conservation finance. The funds are accompanied by so-called technical assistance packages. This means there's a lot of money made available to develop and work on capacity development on the beneficiary side and to bring basically the projects to fruition. As Isabel has already said, I would like to speak in more detail today about the Green for Growth Fund, short GGF. The fund is a 750 million vehicle to date. That translates 1.3 billion investments made so far. Thank you. And is very much a vehicle to deliver on the EU climate finance agenda, the EU Green Deal. So these are all green investments that are undertaken by the fund. The fund is actually in establishment for already 13 years, so has a very long track record. One of our initiators is the EIB, where we have worked with since then very successfully in developing the fund and also furthering the investment agenda next to some of the other public shareholders and private sector shareholders, of course. The countries that we're focusing on here is Southeastern Europe. That would be the traditional region of the GGF, including also the Eastern Neighborhood region, and then the Caucasus, and also MENA as a new investment region. The way we work is for once through financial institutions. This is where we can really reach the biggest scale, I have to say, and these are also the most of the institutions that we have currently in the fund. We basically put requirements down to financial institutions on the ESG side that then really trickles down to the real economy and has quite a scale effect. We also work through corporates, so think about electric vehicles, energy efficient housing, and also in the project finance sector by doing direct investments in renewable energy assets. Of course, the work with the regulators is also not to be underestimated. I think there's also quite a lot of happening there. For example, we've started working on the taxonomies and developed taxonomies, green taxonomies for Armenia and Georgia, but it's also ranging to more normal environment and social risk management systems that are being developed together with the regulator. I would like to say a little bit about Egypt and give a bit of a practical example there. So actually in MENA, Egypt is the largest recipient country of the fund. We have expanded to MENA in 2016. It's the first one of the MENA region that we have entered, and we have a wonderful and very successful cooperations with the local banks And the banks have really successfully on-lent the product of the GGF into green lending, into the greening the economy in certain subsectors. And we keep expanding our relationship with the banks here locally as well. We also have quite successfully invested in solar projects on the Big Ben Solar Park alongside the IFC. These were 2 solar investments in the project finance space that deserve to be mentioned. And what we are really moving into is what we call so-called deep greening initiatives. So this goes in the territory now outside of the investment to the technical assistance and allocation. So you see here, GGF has a rough budget over 20 million in technical assistance, where quite a share of that flows into Egypt. And we now start going beyond the sectorial lending through banks to the actual deep greening of the institutions themselves, meaning developing green products, but also really developing sustainability practices, incorporating these as core pillars for the institutions. This is so far a deep dive, short one into finance in motion, and now handing over to Ela.
Thank you, Britta. So, Ella, please.
You want to try? Okay, it's a bit high. So, hello, and I think I'll just give it up and come directly over here. Thank you from my side as well. So, representing EIB's views on this one, and I guess one could say in a way that impact investing was invented or started by MD multilateral institutions, because what we do is always means to be serving some public policy objectives, and it can be poverty alleviation, it can be reconstruction after a war, environmental and social causes, but everything we do is always supposed to have this kind of impact. So that's why I said a bit flippantly that maybe MDBs invented impact investing. This is our bread and butter business anyways. Focus points may be of course different, and geographical zones are certainly different. But I think the what is slightly or slowly changing in the MDB world is that whereas we only used to talk about volumes in the past, that we did X billion or X 100 billion, now we are also talking about the impact of that money. One of the reasons is also that nobody, not even the MDBs or public sector banks, have unlimited resources, i.e. capital, first of all, to do anything and everything everywhere. So we need to focus, and we need to see where does the money bring the biggest or the most important impact. So this is quite natural, and as you saw in the previous presentation, one is looking also at the not only greenhouse gas emissions, but there are plenty of other impacts or outcomes that are looked at in that sense. And I think this is a very healthy evolution. So in EIB's case, we have labeled ourselves the EU Climate Bank, and that means, of course, that first of all we implement the EU priorities and policies. It doesn't mean that we only operate in the EU, because 10 to 20% of what we do annually goes outside the EU in emerging markets. Climate Bank, being a climate bank, means a very clear and large commitment into climate change mitigation, but also adaptation. For example, last year COP, our main or one of our main commitments there was to increase substantially our adaptation finance, and this is something that we try to bang this message in every possible turn, and I'm banging that here as well. Adaptation, i.e. financing the reparation or living with the damage that we have already done, is something very, very important. Now, being an EU climate bank, emphasis on the EU side, also means that we follow the EU policies and rules and criteria in terms of what is regarded as climate finance or environmental finance. And we have committed to follow the EU taxonomy for our environmental lending, which is targeted to be 50% in 2025. Actually, we already are pretty much there. And these criteria, everybody says that, oh, but they are so demanding. Well, they are, and they are meant to be, because, well, we are not, we don't have that much time anymore. But also, this is what I said earlier, that you need to see where the impact is biggest, i.e. where do you make a substantial contribution. You may have investments. Oh my God, this noise is getting just worse and worse. Do they have some planes flying above our heads as well? I think so. Another president is leaving or something. And maybe we'll get the Wi-Fi back when the presidents go out. So, okay. So about the substantial contribution that the EU taxonomy demands, it is also showing where do you make the biggest impact with your money. And this, I think, is very helpful for us and for everybody. It should be in the market. It gives you some guidance that this is what you should be doing if you want to call yourself or your activity green or sustainable. EIB as a firm has been quite instrumental, of course, in developing these standards and the taxonomy and those criteria. Doesn't mean that we know them by heart and it's easy for us. It's not. But we know now what it means to be Paris aligned. We have those definitions, at least for certain activities. Now, just to mention an example of those things, and I wanted to take, of course, an example on Egypt, since we are in Egypt, and since you also took examples in Egypt. So, for example, we are now working with the Egyptian government on a project which is supporting the country to build resilience towards food shortages, which are due either to climate change or to food price spikes due to the war that we have in Ukraine. And it is meant to strengthen the resilience of that food supply by increasing the storage capacity of wheat in particular, and in modern silos which reduce the losses that you have in grain storage and handling. Here we quite clearly see that there is a very tangible, very concrete impact, of course, on everybody's everyday life. There's also a big program where we are part of it. We are not the only one. There's other MDBs as well. This initiative to tackle the pollution of the kitchenette drain that will improve irrigation in almost 200,000 hectares of land, and it benefits the communities all along the Nile Delta. Again, a very concrete impact, as you can see. So this is what we have done during COVID. For example, in Europe, we did guarantees for SMEs to keep their businesses going over this valley of death. We financed vaccine development, vaccine production, healthcare in anything and everything that was healthcare. It was new hospital beds, new ventilators, new whatever, even sort of hospital budgets to pay the nurses and the doctors and so on. So what an MDB like us does, it clearly needs to have an impact, otherwise we wouldn't finance it. That will leave to the private sector then. This was my opening statement. Hopefully you could hear something through all that noise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hela and Britta, for your concrete example and element of answers. I would like to So basically, Britta, could you tell us what are the key challenges for impact asset managers like Finance in Motion when it comes to investing in sustainable assets in your target markets? I think Dirk is trying to find a solution. Thank you, Professor Zetsche.
Yes? Okay, great. We have sound. So there we are. Let me turn off the other microphone and then we go on. to invest in more renewable energy assets, yes, but at the costs that are currently coming for the corporates, for example, on the energy cost side, or in the renewable energy space, component costs that have increased so massively. These are huge challenges, right? And so that's something to be seen how we're going to do it. And then I think lastly is on measuring and identifying the impact and the access to impact data, and how we are actually going to report to our regulators what we are doing in the markets, right? Especially on the emerging market side. So in an ideal world, we would have an end-to-end ESG solution where we just can aggregate all the data from all the various sources, including from the investee companies that we are investing in, and then put this through to our regulator. But unfortunately, we're far from that. In the GGF that I've brought as an example, I think we have found a good solution. You have more standard projects where, let's say, they're a little bit more measurable, and they're easy to find proxies and be able to identify the impact. But clearly, when we come into large industrial projects, you need technical assistance, you need consultants to be able to verify this for you. So that's for the challenges on my end.
Thank you, Britta. Yeah, definitely this is still a way forward. Ayla, what are basically the challenges, the key challenges faced by the EIB, and what are the barriers that you face?
Thank you. In fact, I don't know, some people might be surprised to hear that the challenges for public sector banks or MDBs are not that different than they are for the private sector. Well, regulatory-wise, for example, EIB, we are not obliged to be reporting things, but we do because we follow best banking practices, i.e. what commercial banks have to do. We will follow the same route to the parts that it's applicable for our business, of course. So that means that we are by no means immune to these challenges at all. On the contrary. I think that there will be, a professor will talk more about this, some of these challenges and data availability and all of that, because data is one of the key issues, because the regulator in Europe now, i.e. the Commission and the legislators, they have gone to the direction where you need to produce for your reports very, very high quality data, preferably something which is even verified by, for example, by your auditor. And this is already very challenging in Europe when you have, in many cases, data available. When you go outside Europe, we don't have similar systems, even for reporting or for data or for certifying, for example, energy efficient buildings or giving emission information on electric vehicles and so on. Don't try, I'll yell louder than you do, so let's go into competition here. The further you go from the heart of the regulation, the more you have problems, because even if you have information, it's not necessarily in the same format or it's not compatible. But we certainly see this in emerging markets because that's where we operate. So, you know, there is this permanent body which is called Sustainable Platform for Sustainable Finance, which is an advisory body to the European Commission to give advice on any legislation they are doing on sustainable finance. And I have been working in their usability subgroup, usability on taxonomy and all this regulation. No surprise, when we put out our report a month ago, it was 152 pages. So there are plenty of usability issues, and one of them is how to use the, for example, taxonomy outside EU, and I'm now focusing on that particular angle here. And there is plenty, like I said. So we put out recommendation to the Commission. They are, of course, free to take on board our recommendation or not, but I think these are things that they will probably mostly work on. So, for example, we recommended that you work on international equivalencies. So if we have a building certification in Europe, how does that relate to similar kind of certification systems in other countries? Sometimes it's emerging markets, sometimes it can be Japan or Canada or something, but we need these equivalencies, and only the regulators can actually work on this, what they accept as equivalent or not. We also asked for the do no significant harm requirements, which are, I think, the toughest part in many cases, that they be clarified. For example, avoid any language which is saying you should be avoiding, or you should be trying to maximize, or vague language. Ask yes or no clear questions where you can ask either, where you can answer yes or no, and numerical targets if possible. So be very precise and be very clear, not to have language like you should try to avoid polluting, whatever. We also sort of asked them to start making sort of mapping between EU-based rules or technical criteria and those which are most widely internationally used. Often they are those used by MDBs. EIB has its own standards, IFC has standards, OECD has got the Rio markers. So we say this is one of the high urgency recommendation. Start working on those mappings, because it would be better to do this than to just start recreating the wheel everywhere for every country outside EU. We also recommend very strongly and very clearly earmark and give funds for technical assistance for all of this work, first of all, because it is going to require a lot of it, and technical assistance for filling the data gaps, creating transition language where needed, because you can imagine in some country, for example, they have not collected certain type of data at all. They have some other kind of data, and you may have to create transitionary period bridges. Okay, we have this now, how does it relate to what we actually want at the end of the period? We need this transitionary data, and give us that guidance. Also we need, and we recommended that very clearly, technical assistance and technical capacity building in the emerging market countries, so that this is done for the local systems and local providers, not just to pay international consultants, nothing against them in principle, but that money is gone when the consultants leave the country. We need the local systems to be built up. So we need money for this. So this was a long list to Santa Claus, I know, but it is all very necessary and very urgently needed work, and hopefully now the Commission puts some work and money into this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Britta, how can we ensure that private investors have still a huge appetite for impact investing projects?
Well, clearly, the private sector will need to see returns next to impact, right? So we need to return an adequate risk-return profile. No, private sectors want to have social impact and green impact, right? So they want to see it, and certain assets lend themselves quite well to it. If we think about green energy, for example, so in the emerging market context, the emerging market will be the growth demand driver of the energy needs of the future. This is why also the MDBs have been so very active in supporting the space, and the MDBs will be very relevant going forward for, in particularly, very innovative structures, complex structures, structures where there's no track record. But also in the renewable energy space, private sector investors find a little bit more cohesion, a little bit more understanding and definition about the assets that they're financing. So this is why we do see private sector participation there. I think it's going to be a little bit more challenging if we look in the energy efficiency space, especially for smaller measures that are often not very profitable and that would need to be packaged into more bankable solutions. So definitely help in the energy efficiency space is needed. And private investors who are clearly committed to the SDGs will not be deterred, I hope, too much by the macroeconomic headwinds that we're facing. But I think it's also understandable that those who equally weigh impact with returns, that they have a challenging time right now, and I think we also need to acknowledge that. This is where blending solutions come in. And this is where vehicles, for example, like the GGF, something that has a track record, can provide integrity in conjunction with labels, for example, that provide that investor confidence, that really bring in private sector participants to these challenging markets. It's really around finding entry points, right? Investors need to see something familiar. As I said, adequate risk and return they need to see, but also familiar investment structures and a vehicle that provides integrity in the reporting on what they're doing.
Thank you, Britta. Ayla, what are also how do you make sure that for public investor there is also the appetite is there, and that for the strategy to invest in certain products there have a certain interest? Thank you.
Well, I think the appetite per se is there. If you hear the MDBs, what they talk about in events like this, I'm sure you hear that they are willing and able to do plenty. Of course, one has to say that EIB or World Bank or any other of EBRD, they are not the ones who take the decisions on the investments to be made. Somebody else takes that decision. In Egypt, it's a government or the private sector companies, but they are the ones who decide, and then they come to the finance providers to talk about it, and then we have to take the decision, shall we finance, with which conditions, and so on. So we are not the one that, we can't push the thing. It's sort of trying to pull and offer technical advantage and assistance and so on. But in that sense, of course, even public sector banks, they need to look at their, for example, capital numbers, their capital adequacies. And usually when you go to emerging markets, the risk factors, rightly or wrongly, are higher. And I have just heard recently from African Development Bank that if you look actually what the NPLs are, the perception on African countries is far too high compared to reality. So that is one thing. But regulatory rules are what they are. You don't change them overnight. And capital is needed. And if you don't have that capital, then you need maybe risk-sharing schemes with other public sector. We have done this several times now with the European Commission. There's another new risk-sharing scheme, which there are several implementing agencies. It's not only us. And these kind of things, I think, are very efficient because they work on the portfolio and not just project by project, but you have, for example, a first loss guarantee on a portfolio, and it's supporting quite nicely with the rating agencies, but it doesn't take that much from resources from the one who gives that guarantee. I think it's this is one thing, and then what you mentioned, the word bankability already. Bankability, getting projects over that finishing line so that they are bankable. Once you have that, everybody will come. It's like build it properly and they will come. So private sector money, public sector money, when you have that, it's going to come. Good example was, this was already must be 15 years ago when they built the extension of the Panama Canal. I think there was 100 institution bank line outside their doors offering money, and they just have to choose which ones they took and which ones they didn't. So that shows that money is there when you have the project. It is the problem comes much earlier. How do you structure the project and the investment so that it is truly bankable? Thanks.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, that rating agencies have an important role to play. Labels also, I believe, are also in that sector. But do you think they will be sufficient to accompany that transition somehow? Do you think also that the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure will help also? It will be sufficient to contribute to that? Do you want to answer?
Okay, then I'm gonna maybe try to answer the question. So, I mean, yes, I think it is needed. I think the Sustainable Finance Regulation is absolutely relevant to give a framework, to give the standards in what to invest in, and everything that is certainty provides confidence and then links back to the private sector, and I think would increase investment there as well. Now, as Ayla has already said, obviously the EU regulation is very EU-centric, and it's also for the EU counterparties particularly ambitious. So we just need to think what the impact of that would be on the emerging market and what it is on the emerging market in terms of ambition levels. So yes, we need an enabling framework, but we do need investors. And this is where the matter of data providers and the roles of, for example, LuxFlag becomes very relevant and very important to give that access to the data. And I mean, we know it from our own experience working with LuxFlag for all this time. It is hard work. It is work intensive. We need to get this primary data. But in the end, what we can show is with integrity, something to our investors, and with confidence that we do have the data and that we can report it.
Thank you. I'm still not quite sure I heard that. Yeah, please do repeat.
Yeah, thank you, Britta. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Ella, whether you think that it's sufficient to have labels out there for selecting some of the project, and whether also the EU regulatory framework at the time now is also something that will be sufficient for accompany the transition. What's your opinion on that?
I think the labels are, I mean, institutions like us, we don't invest necessarily in the labels because we are there to sort of support it. That's rather our role. And for example, in this, we are co-investors in this fund, so we give a kind of the risk capital, if you like, can be differently structured. But I think it's for the private sector investors and then also retail investors. For them, this is utterly important because somebody else has done the work. They don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise and capacity to do this work. So for them, I think these labels are extremely useful because somebody else has done the work, those people who have the expertise. So I think that is my take on it. And firms like and banks like us, public sector banks, we need to be acting there to put the sort of the risk layer or the seed capital, whatever you want to call it, in different structures to support them. And to, I think this is the famous crowding in private sector capital, what you call it.
So Britta, I would like to also ask you, which solution have you identified that can support you and other engaged actors to accelerate sustainable finance?
I think it's a very big question. It is the question. I mean, I cannot say I unilaterally have identified it, but I can offer some thoughts, I think, in terms of where it's going. So obviously we with the fund, the GGF fund, we stand for a blended finance solution. So this is very relevant where we look into then sector-specific solutions and specific asset solutions. I think blending will be key in this intersection between public and private sector partnership. But then also, as I've told you in our introduction, we're building out what we call a deep greening initiative, meaning really working on the capacity building on the financial institution side to make sustainability really a core pillar of what the institutions are doing and not only narrowly focusing on one part of their portfolio that they're financing, but really looking into the entirety of their portfolio. This is the biggest challenge to change, but this will be the biggest solution to accelerate that sustainable finance, because once the banks have it, then we can really speak about scale. So it's the two things: scale, the deepening of the engagement, also being innovative in the instruments that you use in financing them, right? Be it fund structures, be it also all the capital market instruments that are emerging from all everywhere. I think, for example, the impact-linked lending is a wonderful tool, really linking KPIs of the institutions to their cost of fund for a particular instrument. This can be very ambitious and have a very strong demonstration effect. We need success stories of these banks on the one hand, right, that we see market leaders starting to implement this. It's a very difficult topic and we all say how challenging it is, but I think once we see development banks, funds, but also the institutions that we finance actually having first success stories, I think that will go a long way in demonstrating that it's actually possible. And for ourselves on Finance in Motion, we have built out our competence centers quite significantly, because it's a matter of capacity, it's a matter of manpower, especially around more challenging technologies. I think there we have really expanded a lot, including also recently on the whole topic of climate risk management and how we are going to address this and work with our institutions. So there's work to be done on our end to provide the resources to do that in the first place as well. And yes, I think ESG is along the value chain situation. It's not only for the MDBs or for the asset managers. It has to bring in the regulators, the governments, the data providers, and I think a joint solution or solutions are being developed and can be found on the entirety.
Ella, some question to you. Have you identified any solution that could be helpful for everyone? Have you identified any solutions that could be helpful to share with everyone to move further sustainable finance agenda?
Sorry, I really have problems hearing sometimes what is being talked about here. So no, I think I think there have been plenty of possible solutions that have been laid out already. What can be, what can work, what is being done already, and we have discussed this. And I would just like to say maybe something about this ESG in general, because there's a lot of discussion going on now. Is ESG dead? Is it not dead? And I think it's definitely not dead, or rumors about its death are far exaggerated. We need to double up rather than double down. And problems about ESG investing are about not having, nobody having defined what it actually means, or there are 75 different definitions out there, so you can't expect all of them to go to the same direction if you have very different definitions. Somebody can have just exclusion criteria, somebody has very sophisticated impact requirements, like we have just heard, and you cannot expect to get a similar result from them and similar performance from them if you are looking at totally different thing. I have been comparing this to ask 3 people what a healthy diet is, and you get 4 different responses. It's exactly the same with ESG. It's, if you haven't defined it, then you don't know what it is. People like us in this panel, we are definitely committed to this, and we're also trying to show the way what it could be, what is good ESG, and ESG is really emphasis in all 3 letters. It's not only E, it's not only S, it's not only G, it's all of those 3. And what I think is good is that we start to have some definitions on those, at least in the EU, what those letters might mean. Okay, they are not applicable for the whole world, but I think the one who has the first mover advantage has a big advantage is in getting those definitions working, because not everybody is willing to put as much work into it as we have seen in this process. It has been a humongous amount of work. So.
Thank you, Ella. Yeah, and it's just the beginning. So, thank you, Britta. Thank you, Ella. We'd like to hand over to my colleague Ahmed for the Q&A session.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just maybe start with a question, and until we ask if there is more questions in the audience, but maybe opening towards the future. You've talked about data challenges, regulatory challenges that are associated or not. How do you think this is preventing or enhancing the development of the impact investments, and are there other ways than public and private partnerships to sort of fuel the impact investment sector? Any word on this? Who wants to start?
Yeah, okay. No, I think that this, how should I say? It goes a bit backward what we were talking about. I think this is a train that has left the station. We know where it's going. We don't know at which speed. We don't know how many stations it will stop at. But the train has left, and we know where it's going. So in that sense, we are not going back. It's also about getting a lot more information. I mean, 10 years ago, you got very little information about where your money went. As a big lender, certainly as a retail investor, you bought pretty much, you know, you didn't know where the money went to. Now we do get, and we have the right to ask, the regulators, legislators, even investors and companies themselves providing so much more information that we get this, and we have the right to ask. And I think we can, when we talk about impact investing, when we take impact investing in the larger sense, not in the social impact, the thing is that you could have 2 different areas. You have those investments which actually make a clear positive contribution, like what, for example, the fund is looking for. Or then you have the minimum requirements, which is at least do not do any harm. At least don't mess up the targets that the governments and the societies world over have set. And that, I think, everybody needs to align at least with that one. And then we have those who move the needle to the positive direction with a clear, substantial contribution. So both of those are okay, but when we talk about impact investing, we are looking for the latter. And let me just underline that we are not talking about some charity here. People have totally normal return expectations, and they have the right to have so. I think it's even in the long term, if anybody wants to think in long term, it's even better, because let's imagine this. You have somebody who is actually emitting a lot of carbon into the air, and right now they are not really paying for it. But if I want to look at that company and then somebody else who is not doing that, who has improved their carbon emission and is now sort of maybe neutral. The other company, the day that there is a sort of real market price, they are in trouble, right? So this also has a very clear financial bearing. It's just preparing for that. I think it's just a wise investment. We are not talking about some being nice here. It really has a very sound financial base.
Well, thank you. I think it's a healthy reminder, if I may. I'll be looking at the audience. Are there any particular question for a panelist? Yeah? All right. Yeah. Please, yes.
Yeah, of course, of course. Thank you very much, and thank you for the interesting discussion. My name is Jimmy Skenderovich from the Ministry of Climate of Luxembourg, so one of the hosts here. I have first a comment and then a question, and I found the presentation on the Green for Growth Fund very interesting, and I feel a bit obliged to say it because we are here in Luxembourgish Pavilion. This was the first fund under the Luxembourg EIB platform where we have provided 5 million first loss guarantee. So very happy to see that we have contributed to this success. And now to the question is maybe more to Britta. What is your experience with other labels than LuxLag labels? As Finance in Motion and Green for Growth, I think you have LuxLag labels, but you have also other labels, and what is your international experience on labeling?
I will keep my answer very short there. We have, in terms of the other labels, I can unfortunately not speak to them really too much because we have mostly really worked on the LuxFlag side, and I can speak to that cooperation and to the primary data gathering that we're doing for such a long time already. And as I alluded, I think it is very positive for us. We're very happy to be able to do it and to give a little bit integrity to our investors by applying to these type of labels. It is hard work. But it's worth it. That's what can I say. Sorry, I have to keep it short on that one. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess now it's time to thank our panelists for their presence, and on to the next session. Thank you very much.
From LuxFlag. I'm very happy to introduce actually the next session of the LuxFlag side event at COP27. So as we have learned from the previous panel discussion, asset managers and investors are confronted more and more with the task of managing an ever more complex regulatory environment, governing sustainability practices as well as reporting. In the second part of our side event, Professor Zece will help us understand how relevant sustainable finance policies are shaping the playing field for market practitioners. Will such policies help overcome some of the most pressing challenges faced by the investment community today when it comes to sustainable investments? And what are the challenges regulators experience when actually regulating sustainable finance? We will discover this too with our next session. Professor Zece is a professor of financial law at the University of Luxembourg, where he holds the ADA chair in financial law, inclusive finance, since March 2016, and co-chairs the Faculty of Law, Economics and Finance, House of Sustainable Governance and Markets. Professor Zece is the author of more than 350 publications and is listed on SSRN in the top 10 law authors worldwide. Professor Zece is a member of the ESMA Standing Consultative Working Group on Financial Innovations, co-chairs the European Banking Institute's FinTech Working Group, and functions as a director of the Academic Society of Investment Law in Chicago. His current research focuses on inclusive and sustainable finance, as well as financial and corporate law, in particular on payment and banking system, collective investment schemes, institutional investment, and fintech. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberta. And in lawmaking, it's a little bit like in this room. It's not always that the voices are heard that shall be heard, and so we'll try to give it the right voice under the right circumstances. I feel reminded a little bit like in a large hearing room with thousands of students, and that's also about making the right voices heard. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. It's the first appearance at a COP for me, and it's really impressive to see that all of these people around us want to air their voice, and in particular here it's crucial to put principles in the discussions when we move forward. So the first question is, why do we need regulation in the first place? Why don't we leave that to the market as such, and how do SDGs fit into the regulatory perimeter? Another key question that we always have is, if we regulate, how to get it right. We already heard quite a number of concerns from Britta and Ayla that if we regulate it in the wrong way, we will create data gaps and so on. But now, after a few years of trying to address these things from a regulatory perspective, we have a few lessons learned, and these are the ones that I try to summarize. In this regard, we will first deal with the role of regulation in general before we will deal with a few particularities, how to get things right and avoid some mistakes that we currently observed. Ladies and gentlemen, when we ask yourselves, why don't we leave it to the market? Then we also ask the question, is law necessary? Is law and regulation has a purpose in this? And here we have a few problems when we leave the markets alone. The first is they cannot price adequately sustainability impacts. That's a huge issue because the risks are a bit vague, the data is muddy, and it's all forward-looking, and forward-looking risks on not very precise data and on bad models, I have to say as well, are very badly priced by markets. So as such, the markets are bad at pricing things that come in the future at very uncertain rates. Then another reason why we need regulation is to activate private capital. When we think about private capital in this sector, we need to think that the alternative is just public funding. Public funding is limited. First of all, because the fiscus cannot charge taxes endlessly, but the other reason it's because it's volatile. Together with political swings, also the readiness to finance certain projects swings. And when we have private capital can be more persistent in pursuing certain missions, as we see in the long ESG streams, which is more than a decade old, meanwhile. Yeah? And in this regard, activating private capital also means a more stable capital flow and a more large volume capital flow. That doesn't mean that the public doesn't have a role in the hand, but the right approach seems to be a mix of public and private capital depending on which mission we're pursuing. A very crucial aspect here is ensuring fair competition. Many people use these words greenwashing, but the true problem here is how do two type of intermediaries compete for capital? What rules do they have adhered to? When the one person can just promise a lot of things and doesn't hold to be liable by the law, then of course these type of promises are mushrooming, and over time the disclosures are simply not credible. And here, ensuring fair competition among the different intermediaries is a crucial aspect of regulation. Another aspect, and I think this is something that is often estimated, law is not only a cost, it's also a cost reduction. By standardizing certain elements of language, we reduce transaction cost. Everyone who is from Luxembourg will know the term UCITS, because this is a product that is strongly standardized by law for many years. And in this regard, we have a similar function now to deal with the terms. And Ayla mentioned the point, when we don't know what ESG is, we cannot invest in it because we don't know what we're investing in. And here it's exactly the role of law to ensure that we reduce transaction costs in this way. Finally, of course, the traditional function of how we protect investors and clients is a traditional function of law that we shouldn't not forget. If I want to invest in a certain rainforest protection, then I don't want to be misled, and this is a very traditional thing. And probably the last parameter that has become more and more eminent in the last months is the systemic dimension of sustainability. Many of us had overseen for years that the climate impact, the environmental impact, is of systemic dimension because it's all connected. What we trigger today will impact us in 5, 10, 15 years from now, and that systemic dimension is linked to so many other things that no product alone can really make a change. It is a system, and that must be regulated as such sufficiently well. So when we believe in a market-based or market-supported transformation, we need some initial state activity, which is leveraged through capital markets, and then we need some stick, because a carrot may be the benefit, but the stick is the law. And in this regard, the law gives, let's say, a little bit of notch to play by the rules and not to mislead the respective actors. So when we think about all of this, 3 key points come to mind. First, what is sustainable? Second, who acts sustainably? And then ensuring that what they promise they do is really what they eventually do. Yeah, because this is very often, when it turns out to be costly to keep your promise, then it really matters whether you keep your promises. And this is exactly what the law ensures. So all of these matters, of course, are now put into legislation in certain aspects. Before I go into those details, let's just say a word about what the role of the UN SDGs in this. The UN SDGs are very broad missions, very broad and very unprecise. From a legal perspective, broad definitions means they're unenforceable. That means you can't go to a financial regulator and ask them to enforce a law that is so broad that it leaves a lot of interpretation. So we need to put down these very broad principles into a workable definition, and that happens with the classification systems that I will discuss in a minute. Here, one aspect is so obvious, but at the same time often overlooked. Because the key to any market-based transformation is that the actors have access to the markets. And when we believe in sustainable finance, that means they must have access to sustainable finance. And for that reason, when we believe that, or when we know that more than 1.5 billion people on the planet have not access to finance, and they support then a lot of kids and elderly people, we can believe that financial inclusion is a precondition for the whole sustainable finance agenda. And that is not so much a concern in the so-called northern countries. There the problem is not the technical access, but the meaningful use of the financial system, which is also a dimension of financial inclusion. And here it is crucial to understand that the whole sustainable finance agenda believes in access to finance, and this is something that has also then another dimension when we consider that access to finance has probably an unmatched role in furthering the UN SDGs. Why is that? Pretty simple. When you look at the UN SDGs in like access to justice, but also gender equality and all of these aspects, there is not a single one of them not indirectly furthered by financial inclusion, because financial inclusion gives financial sovereignty, the ability to transfer funds from, let's say, some cultural dominance. It could be a male dominance, it could be a female dominance, that's not so matter. That doesn't matter so much, but it is a key aspect of freedom of, to have financial sovereignty. In the last 2 years, one additional aspect came on top, which has not been seen before, but it's very crucial so far. Sustainable crisis management also rests on financial inclusion. When we think of the pandemic, there was no other way to channel funds to the people than through the financial system, because no one would meet each other. That was an aspect that has been overlooked for decades, but has basically reinforced the case that we need to bring the people into the financial system to use the financial system for a sustainability transformation. It's very logical, but it is basically a connexus which we need to do when we think about the future of sustainable finance. It requires, of course, that our financial system works well. Another aspect that is very crucial here is to understanding what sustainable finance is. The left side is something that we always did. It is not really sustainable finance. That is internalizing sustainability risks. Let me give you the simple example that I often use in the classroom. You have a house on the Maldives. I think if you have that for the last 30 years, you either built dams or entered into an insurance contract or did whatever risk mitigation device because you knew that the sea level was rising. This is what everyone was doing because it is the internalized externality. It is something that comes upon you and which for sure you will just internalize in your banking books. And if you don't do it, you're a bad risk manager. The new aspect is the aspect of externalities, to consider what we do to the environment. This is where sustainable finance truly starts, where we take not so much the perspective of what is the environment doing on us, but what we do to the environment. And here we need to consider that whenever we start regulating, that when we only consider the own perspective, the internalization perspective, we may optimize our portfolio, but we will not make a change. The change comes with the right side, the perspective of the environment, which is a public good, and no one fights for public goods because you don't feel it. By definition, a public good is something that is owned by everyone, and we all know something that's owned by everyone is owned by no one. Yeah? No one cares for it. So, in this regard, double materiality at the core of all what we do, not only to consider what the environment or the social factors do to us on our financial well-being, this is something that we need to do anyway, but also to consider the outside dimension. So, and in this regard, ESG is basically an effort to put more specific definitions to the UN SDGs. There's nothing else. Of course, it's still vague, but that is simply due to the fact that ESG is a market-driven development. In the origin, it's a market-driven idea. Regulators started to consider ESG in some countries of the planet around 2009, 2010. We have good examples from Fiji, for example, that had already then certain environmental standards which are put to market tests. Some other countries started 2011, 2012. But let's say the major part of the world woke up in the last 5 years, let's be fair. Maybe 2016. So, and in this regard, we are still at the end of a market-driven development, and that also means that the definitions are vague, but as Ayla said, we're getting more and more to technical definitions than are workable. So we translate the UN SDGs in ESG and that into a classification system, a taxonomy. Let me just make one observation here in this context. From my perspective, when I look at the UN SDGs, we had a very strong emphasis on environmental concerns in the EU taxonomy, which is very explainable given how the European Commission came to the topic. But when you look at the most emerging and developing economies, there the focus is not so much on protecting the environment, but dealing with the fallout of environmental damage caused 10, 20, 30 years ago. Crisis management is there the key concern, whether it is lack of water or too much water, rising sea levels. All of this is crisis mitigation and not so much crisis prevention. So let me go back to the key concept of sustainable finance regulation. In this regard, Ayla mentioned some aspects already, and I want to emphasize maybe a few others. Classification is only easy in theory. When you do it in practice, you come down to questions like how much water can go through an irrigation system without being harmful, or how much energy a house can use. And these are very technical engineering questions. And when you put that now into legislation, something that is a legislative, basically a technical standard, becomes enforceable. And that has certain black and white characteristics which are harmful to transition. Let me just give you an example. Let me take our -15 energy consumption of our zero energy house as a precondition to deem it sustainable. Now consider that you have an old house which has a +50 use, and you want to build a house at -14, not -15. Then it's unsustainable under the taxonomy. Unfortunately, -14 is still a huge win as compared to the old +50. Yeah? So, and this transitional effect is something that we need to reconsider a bit stronger when we want to build a classification system that doesn't have these binary effects. And I will come back to that in a few minutes. Let me also say that the taxonomy is not the only way how you can do it. You can also do it by the classification board upon appeal, so when you get a case. And much of what the MDBs are doing is a bit going into the direction when you have one project that comes from the member states, you look at it, or when you look at central banks of EMBEs, there often you have this one case that is classified upon appeal. Of course, the downside, case-by-case decisions have also downsides when it comes to, let's say, individual justice. And here, of course, we need to consider good governance rules to make them true. Second aspect, who is sustainable? Here, it's crucial to cover the whole financial value chain from the issuers and financial product developers down to the beneficiaries. Again, this sounds easy, but it is not, because many of these actors may not be regulated in a way that they're inside the parameter of the regulation that we think applies. So let's, for instance, assume that the fund and asset manager is in the EU and the pension fund is outside the EU, then you have already a regulatory shift. So harmonization of core principles become key to have an effective system and not just a kind of paper tiger that we create. Finally, ensuring sustainable conduct. Here it is really tricky. Why? Because when we think about on-balance intermediaries like banks, those on-balance intermediaries have the traditional risk-based approach from Basel. The Basel Accord says, let's put additional capital to greater risks. If we now assume that we have our picture in double materiality between the red side, the internalized risks, and the green side, the externalities, by definition, externalities don't impact the portfolio. And that means you can capitalize them. And when you capitalize the internalized risks, they may have unwanted effects because you enter into financial exclusion. Why is that? Because small and medium enterprises are usually the greatest risks financially. The result will be, when you apply the traditional on-balance sheet logic, that you have those out of the system which you need in the system for the transformation, and at the same time you don't have the external dimension capitalized. For that reason, using capital requirements for achieving a sustainability transformation is a very, very, very difficult thing, and I'm not sure it's leading in the right direction. I think more in a kind of market-based transformation driven by the investors into the bank, and that goes then to the off-balance sheet intermediation that we do. And here the mix of disclosure rules and holding entities liable for whatever promise they give in terms of ESG, together with a very strong trend towards ESG, can probably tip the tide, because if the investors in a bank push for ESG, the respective bank will do it over time, regardless of whether they have to put capital underneath or not. So from that perspective, it is correct to focus on the fiduciary duties of the investment managers, of the risk managers, when it comes to triggering the transformation, if we want to avoid exclusive effects, because this is always my precondition. Always keep in mind, please, that for me, financial inclusion is a precondition for a true transformation. Yeah? Okay. We all know the example from the taxonomy, which has now this kind of three-layer test. You need to have a substantial contribution to one environmental objective. You shall not do harm to any other environmental objective and have to comply with certain minimum legal safeguards. And the problem here is just the amount of words used to define that. Yeah? It's just not handleable with 800 pages in detailed regulation. That is extremely costly for the financial sector, and for that reason, at least when we go outside of Europe, Europe has regulatory capital, it can invest in improving this, but if I would have a regulator with less capital and resources, I would probably recommend a different approach. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the problem right now? The word data gap is everywhere, but what is data gap in detail? Data gap in detail doesn't mean that the firm doesn't know what its activity creates in terms of financial output. That's not the problem. The data gap starts when you ask a firm, how do you deal with externalities? Why don't they have data of externalities? Simply because externalities don't impact on their balance sheet. That's why they never collect it. It's not a risk steering device. So now all of a sudden, they have to take care, for instance, when they produce carpets, how carpets impact on biodiversity, i.e. the amount of bees flying around. This is simply not the concern of a carpet production. So how should they collect data on something that is not there in their parameter? And that is truly a problem when you ask those who produce on the economic side also to ask for the data. Even if you get data, that data will be fully tainted because it is impacted by their own interests to have zero impact. So you either have no data or bad data. And from that perspective, I believe it's really, really important that we fill that data gap not by private sources, but by some type of publicly audited sources. For instance, statistical offices in countries where this works, rather than putting the onus to show that you do not significant harm on the very production companies which have a strong interest to lie. Second, we have a lack of models for double materiality. We have a lot of models for the internalized risks, but the connection between external factors and financial output is almost non-existent. There is one study showing that there's a bit of lack of volatility, but that may also be explained from the perspective that the investors who are sustainable have less choice to opt out if the financial performance is disappointing, and for that reason they stay in the investment longer than they would if a swap would be possible at zero cost like in other products, in non-sustainable products. For that we have no evidence actually that what we do has truly a good outcome. And that is a weak point in the whole sustainable finance story, and this is something that we need to deal with. We need to deal with a convincing argument of what we do matters. And here I think once we fill the data gap with better data, maybe this second aspect may be addressed. So addressing the data gap is really key in everything here. Then even in the most advanced economies, we have a shortage of skilled human resources. I would say that in whole Europe, there may be 20 people who have understood the regulatory framework around sustainable finance right now, among 450 million people. Yeah? And that is very telling, because when the complexity gets so high, no one can use the framework because the knowledge in itself is a rare resource. And here we need to work on widening capacity, not only in developing countries, but also in the so-called north of the planet, to have sufficient skilled human resources so that sustainability is mainstream and not a costly extra service. We already spoke about the legal fragmentation and uncertainty that we have from definition, so I don't want to waste further time on it. But maybe one aspect is crucial, and that is about ambition. When you are over-ambitious, you will achieve nothing. And that's extremely important to understand what it means. When you ask everyone on the planet to move from the combustion engines tomorrow to an electric vehicle, assuming that an electric vehicle is sustainable, 99.99% of this planet will not be able to do it, and that means you achieve nothing. When you all of them ask of them to go 2 or 3 liters down on their consumption, that is feasible. So asking for less may achieve more. And that is, of course, counter-indicative to political instinct, which always asks for the next push before you even have reached the first one. But adjusting your ambitions is better if you want to achieve anything. So what shall we do? We should focus on national priorities. We need a good screening where your main drivers are, not only in terms of sustainability risk, but also where your respective economic activity impacts on other businesses. And that should define your respective national priorities. Then second aspect here, very crucial, is that we have an active regulator who admits that the regulator is not fully capable and knowledgeable, that we are in sandbox thinking. We're trying out. It's all a huge experiment to achieve something. And that requires a certain experimental period. There will be a final period later, once we have a better state. But right now, we're in a phase where we know nothing. We are very much in a state where we just try out things and need to learn and need to get better models. For instance, that means that we achieve elements of mutual learning. The private sector, the public sector, the regulators must sit together and think about what is feasible, what is viable, where we can still provide profits to, for instance, our pensioners, which we want to finance, or investors. All of that requires sitting together, knowledge exchange, basically very much like has become the norm in the fintech space in the last 10 years. Yeah? There, again, regulators learn from the private sector and the other way around. And I think this is very, very crucial. And also a little bit leniency when the data are maybe not 100% precise. Because getting to precision in terms of data up to 100% means, again, achieving nothing because these data don't exist. Yeah? When you ask for 100% of data, as you already mentioned, Ayla, you will have a very niche, very sustainable sector, and mainstream will be simply unsustainable, and then the impact is zero. So here again, adjusting expectations is crucial. Another aspect based on research we have done at our chair is to think about how we classify things. Right now we have a bit of a black-white model which has unwanted effects because, as I used the example with the switch from the combustion engine to electric vehicles, the switch is just extremely expensive and hard to take. So this kind of traditional classification results in a bit of a gradual precision because it gives us a very niche focus, for instance carbon dioxide, but leaves a lot of other aspects of the sustainability dimension out. So our idea is to move towards a scorecard which sees transition and uses basically similar techniques but just on a scoring basis. We accept with that a little bit of uncertainty. For instance, product developers will always see them more in the 6 rather than the 5, but that is a gradual and a very, very minor impact as compared to the upside that such a scorecard approach will better trigger transition, which we currently don't do in the current classification system. Then one aspect entirely overseen so far is how to deal with small entities. How do we deal with the micro, small and medium enterprise of this world? In Europe, 23 million enterprises are small, medium and micro enterprises, while around 50,000 are non-MSMEs. How do we deal with the majority of firms? The answer is probably not in the same way as with the large ones. So our idea here is that we ask the SMEs to define one mission where they want to contribute to an UNSG, and in that regard they need to show that they make a valuable contribution. Whether they are subject to a do not significant harm barrier or the governance criteria, that shall be filled up with public data rather than kind of activity-based data, and thereby we would get a label whether they are sustainable or not. You see what we do here, we take the data gathering mission out of the MSME and put it towards the respective public institutions which have an interest in maintaining the environment. That's the core idea. And then the second aspect is we should go away from the institution-specific data towards aggregate approaches. We do that in Basel, in risk capital requirements anyway, but in this regard, we want to do it also in terms of sustainability data. Now my voice must be even louder, but I'm trained in lectures, so no chance here. So, final aspect, impact requires impact evidence. We need to be good at showing what we do makes a change. And here I ask for further research in impact measurement, and that requires a joint coalition of environmental scientists, of finance people, and of lawyers to identify that they truly have a meaning, because sustainable finance is no means in itself. It only matters that if we have a change that we can show, only then the market will follow. Because the market is sure about the cost and uncertain about the benefits. With that, I'm at the end of my lecture and my presentation. I'm very happy to collect your questions, if any. And otherwise, I thank the organizers for the wonderful framework and also the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Before we proceed to question, I think there's a number of comments that we want to discuss right now, also with Ela. So, handing over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Very interesting, and almost everything I agree with. Double materiality, perfectly agree, and emerging market developing economies being more interested in crisis management, in adaptation very often, because adaptation is too much water, too little water, and all of the rest. One thing which I would have a somewhat different view is this, our classifications or taxonomy being too ambitious. It's because it's meant to be. This taxonomy, the list of activities, they are not forcing anybody or asking anybody to do anything. It is just to say that this is what a substantial contribution looks like. After that, you have substantial positive contribution, of course. After that, you do have also smaller positive contribution. You have totally neutral contributors. You have small negatives, and you have big negatives, just like you had on your 10-point list. The initial idea with the taxonomy was that, okay, we create this substantial contribution list, which is the really green. If you want to say that you are creating a big impact, this is what it is. A bit over 6 months ago, the platform also made a proposal to the Commission to extend the taxonomy in the no significant impact, i.e. the white zone, and also then to the significantly harmful, which that report used a traffic light approach. So there was a green, there was amber, there was a red one, red some people call brown as well. And then the transition, which everybody talks about but nobody has any definitions for, would have been getting out of the red into the amber zone. And this is the sort of good enough, we can live with this. It's not green, but we can live with this. And this is what everybody wants, but nobody has defined it. Now, unfortunately, this proposal is not taken on the sort of working, under work right now. The Commission now wants to focus on putting the usability of the current taxonomy, the green one, to use. But it's only because it's one part of the puzzle. It is very ambitious because that's what it is meant to be. It was meant to be one end of the scale, and then we have light green and white and light brown and dark brown, but none of that has been done yet or has been commissioned or mandated to be worked upon. So yes, I agree, we need all the rest, we need at least the amber part.
I think that's very much in line with the active regulation and the experiment. Yeah, we are in a sandbox, we try something that mankind has never done before, to make sure that people are interested in something that they're not interested of in the beginning, at least not financially. Yeah? And that is an experiment. It is against human nature to live also idealism when it becomes costly. Yeah? And here we want people to live basically in the tragedy of time horizons, how it was called by McCartney. Cost today, benefits for the future. That is very, very difficult to sell at the elections, and is usually also a failure to fail. And in particular, since politics, whenever it gets too costly, deviates from it. Yeah, let's just look that overnight weapon of war has become sustainable again, gas. Yeah, so there seems to be a certain arbitrary element in all of that, and that is then what I say. It must be robust, data-driven, and with a clear evidence of impact. Otherwise, what we do is just costs. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll be looking at the audience to check if there's any particular question. Yeah, Britta, please.
Thank you very much. I have a very short question. I mean, I see you proposing a little bit, or it's good to have national or local taxonomies. I'm wondering where we're going with this in a wider sense, like if every country starts to have their own definition of criteria, and how we then as investors from the very practical side can ideally deal with that.
When we think of national classification systems, from the perspective of Europe, we have this giant animal which we call taxonomy in mind. When we look at the countries that I work with very often, they start on a green field. They have nothing. So for them, it is about using scarce resources to make some progress. And that is where their biggest problems are. And that means in the beginning they need to focus on what is good for their environment, what is good for their social system. Otherwise they will waste the resources. It's not their concern to deal with our problems to a certain extent. And if they want to make good progress and show that their agenda is convincing, they will, for instance, focus in certain countries on the lack of water, and in other countries on oversupply of water. And this is exactly where we stand right now. Later on, there will probably be some harmonization, and there are circles where harmonization takes place. I'm involved in several working groups with a lot of countries in Africa and Asia where there is some convergence in the methodology, but also in the terms of requirements. But it's simply when you have a lack of water problem, dealing with flooding is not your main problem. And then you shouldn't waste resources on it. It's just how about make effective progress.
Thank you. One question maybe from Ayla's side, and then we'll be closing this session.
No, that was rather a comment. Obviously, when you go to outside Europe, I don't think we can really assume that people just adopt our taxonomy, our rules. But I think where I'm coming from, that the same kind of methodology, as you said, same kind of architecture would make a lot of sense. And then you make the criteria that you need for your own circumstances. And the European architecture has been followed also now by the UK, by Colombia, and I also think South Africa. And Colombia, for example, they added one objective, which was land use, because it's very important for them. So this just makes different systems comparable. And I think that's what we need. We don't need a global system, because otherwise the perfect is the enemy of the good. But what we need is comparability.
Thank you. Any further comment maybe? No? Right. I'll hand over to Isabelle for the closing. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Ahmed. Please join me in thanking our panelists. So, Ella Krevi, Britta Boscher, Professor Secce. Very well done. Thank you so much for your key contribution, insightful solutions also for the future. We have been struggling today for this side event, and we have heard very well about the trend of sustainable finance. This passenger just right around the corner, basically with all the noise, but very well done to all of you, and looking forward to catching up the train later on next year probably. Thank you very much. Yeah. A big applause to all of you.